I want to show you another way to take a look at macros. In the first unit of this course, we took a look at developing macros through the macro recorder. And we've also talked about developing, and you've taken a look at some issues related to Visual Basic also. But I want to show you some other ways to create macros and relate that to some of the programming language concepts and constructs that we've talked about before. So let me run Microsoft Office Word. Now, the version of Word that you see here is the 2010 version. Some of you know that 2016 is coming on its way out sometime, but some people are currently using Office 2013 too. It's very similar among those. The only thing to notice, and I know you must have this already, but I'll just reiterate that, is you need to have this Developer tab, which typically isn't visible by default. You may have to turn that on in your Word options here. Okay? So just make sure you have that Developer tab. I'm pretty sure I showed you this rand function before. Have I done that? Okay. So all I'm going to do, I'm just going to issue the rand function, equal rand, and I'll just do 3, 4 so I can get 3 paragraphs of 4 lines each here. You know what, sorry, I've had so much trouble with the technology here. I don't have things set up to easily, holy cow, where is my, I was going to try to, for those of you on campus, I was going to try to make this bigger a little bit. I just can't do that. So strain your eyes or listen to it or come back and take a look at the course cast so you know what's happening. Now, ultimately, I'm going to do this macro in 3 iterations. I don't think it'll make any sense for me to tell you where I'm going. Let's just do it in 3 different stages here. What I want to do is I want to begin, though, by taking a look at the macro recorder. Because actually, when I record a macro and then investigate the code, I can gain some insight there. So I'm going to, remember, it's a good idea to position your cursor where you may want it to be before you start the macro recorder. But in actual fact, I'm going to home the cursor after I start up the macro recorder, and we'll look and see how that operation is actually done in this Visual Basic for applications. So I'm going to go to the macros button. And again, there are 2 things to keep in mind. Okay, ignore that. I'm going to go to record macro. And here there are 2 things to keep in mind. Number 1, give it a good name. The name should be somewhat descriptive of the functionality here. Okay? But I haven't told you what this thing is going to do. So I'm going to call it change stuff. Give it a good name. That's not a good name. Here, and the next thing that's important is this. Where do you store the macro? It seems to make sense that I want to store it in all documents. But what all documents does is it will store it in a special file on your computer called the normal template. So it's all documents in the sense that all documents on your machine can make use of this macro. Here's the problem. If you send this macro to anybody else, they're not going to see it. So what you really want to do, because ultimately you've got to send me this macro, is you want to store this macro in the document. Since I haven't saved this document, it has the generic Office Word name. It's document 1. But what you want to do is save it there. So in this pull down, you have 2 choices of where to store the macro. Either all documents. For me, don't do that. Now, if you're creating a document for you, that makes sense. Because rather than having the macro just in this one document, it will be available to every document on your computer because it's part of your normal template. But because you want to distribute this macro to me, ultimately I want to see it. That's why we're saying to put it in the current document. Make sense the difference there between those 2 options? So I'll select. Now, the other thing I'm going to encourage you to do is to give this a good description. I won't give it a good description right now because I'm going to develop it and I'm going to show you where this comes from as we move along. Calling it change, calling the macro change, calling a description is not good. As a matter of fact, I should at least put in the description two things that should always be there. And that's the developer's name and the date. We want to know who to blame for this. When you're creating something, I'm just kidding about that. When you're creating something, it's a good idea to identify the creator, and that would be you, and that's just fine. Now, when I issue the OK command, my mouse pointer changes to include this cassette tape. We saw that before. That's the record icon. This is meant to indicate that whatever you do right now, via the keyboard, via the mouse, things other than just, moving the mouse around like that, are going to be captured, recorded, and become part of the macro. So, I'm ultimately going to do, I think, 4 things here. First of all, I'm going to get the cursor to the very top of the document. To do that in Office Word, you hold down the Control key, you press Home. Control Home, that keystroke sequence gets you to the very top of the document. If you just press the Home key, where does the cursor go? Beginning of the line. Exactly. Okay? So I did a Control Home here, got the cursor to the very top of the document. The next thing I'm going to do is I want to select this entire first line. There's a couple ways of doing that. You'll usually find it best if you know the keyboard shortcut to do that. If I hold down the Shift key and then do another keyboard action, another cursor action, that will embody the concept of select. To move to the end of the line, probably makes sense. End of the line. Sorry about that. Is the end key, right? What I did is I held down the Shift key and I pressed the end key to highlight, to select this entire line. The third thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply some formatting. I'm going to change this first line to be italics. Now, if you know there's a keyboard I could, of course, go to the Home menu, select the Home tab. I could look at the font area of the ribbon and do that. There's also a keyboard shortcut, Control I. Hold down the Control key, press I for italics, and I've italicized that entire line. The final thing I'm going to do, I guess, is 2 actions, maybe. I want to move down 2 lines. I'll explain why I'm doing this later. I'm going to press down arrow, down arrow. I want to move down 2 lines, and then no matter where I am, I want to get to the beginning, so I'll press Home. Okay, maybe that was much more than just one more thing. I logically have done 4 things. Go back to the Developer tab. I'm going to select Stop Recording. Now, you know what happens. I mean, I can run this macro, but what I want to demonstrate right now is I want to show you the code that was generated. Oops, did that really quickly. In the code area, this macros button. When I select macros, and this is where we ran things before, but notice I have another option. First of all, there's only one macro, poor name, change. But I have this option to edit. When I select Edit, it's going to open up a new window, the VBA window, the Visual Basic for Applications window. Depending upon how you have things set up, this may totally pop over your Office Word window. So it'll be a little disconcerting because when you close down this one, you're wondering, am I losing my document? You're not. This is Microsoft Visual Basic for Applications. This is VBA. Here's the code. Sorry, the quality of something's happened here with the technology. We actually have a really good graphics card and a really good projector. But between there and here, doesn't look very good, does it? Okay. Sorry about that. This is actually code in a programming language. And that programming language is Visual Basic for Applications. Very close to Visual Basic, somewhat related to something called VBNet. This is Visual Basic, the programming language. Now, a couple things you might be able to tell immediately. Sorry, I know it's really small. See those lines that begin with the single quote mark? Those lines are comments, correct? And you notice that the VBA environment displays them in green. Comments, you might remember reading, are items in your source code that are ignored by the computer. The computer ignores comments. So you're saying, well, that's dumb. Why would I put things in my code that the computer is going to ignore? For the user. And really for the user in this case, we mean either myself as the VBA person or another person who's looking at the VBA. The person who's using the macro will see these comments. They may not mean too much, but I'm going to show you that I'm going to add some other comments that would only be visible for somebody who looks at this code. Putting comments in your code is good professional programming practice. It helps you remember what you did 6 weeks later. It helps somebody else who may look and try to maintain your code figure out what's happening faster at a future point in time. So comments in code are good even though the computer ignores them. Now these comments up front, again, that wasn't, change the macro. Come on. By the way, folks, you're going to see me struggling here because the cursor control layout on this keyboard is radically different than my own. And I don't type that much anyway. I usually just talk. I usually just use text-to-speech. So bear with me while I try to hack my way around this. It'd be much better that I said what this was going to do. So what this is going to do is it's going to change a line to italics. We'll notice what happens when we rerun this macro. But now, here are 4 lines. You know what I'm going to do? Here, I can do this. Be sure to let me know that I'm in. I'm going to sometimes mistake this. I'm going to try to run things here. Okay, don't let me do that. Let me just put them into the Word window. Let's increase the magnification here. That's probably too much. Let's see how this is. Okay, cool. There are the lines. I had 5 lines generated in the code. Here they are right here. Now, what is all this stuff? Most modern programming languages work in the object model. And what you see here are things called methods and functions within methods. It looks a little strange and a little intimidating, but thankfully, VBA, like most programming languages, uses keywords and terms that may generate meaning in us. Okay? This first one, selection.HomeKey. Oh man, I pressed the home key, right? That's how you would tell in VBA, here's pressing the home key. Selection.HomeKey, that method. Now you're saying, but wait a minute, I know sometimes I press the home key, it just goes for other times. Didn't you hold down the control key and press? Yeah. Well, here I have to send it a parameter. The unit that the home key is dealing with is something called WD story. Story in this case means the entire document. Why didn't they say that? Steeped in history. So what this first line means is to do a control home. You could actually type that in. Okay, good. So let's look at this second line then. Selection.N. Oh, remember? I pressed the N key. That's how you tell VBA the dude is pressing the N key. Now, I just pressed AND, so that unit that I'm dealing with is a line, that line. But notice that that parameter is modified. Extend, WD extend. That meant I held down the shift key such that I'm not just moving to the end of the line, I'm actually selecting everything in that line. Aha. Third line. Selection.font.italic. That's basically saying I selected italics. Now you notice that thing that says toggle. Like many of the commands, italic and all the other font face features are toggles. In other words, if I went back to that line that was italicized, highlighted it, and did a Control-I, you know what happens? It reverts back to the regular face. So if it's regular or anything else than italics, it will make it italics. If it's already italics, it turns that off. In other words, it acts as a toggle. It's on-off. That's what that's saying there. Oh, you know what? Let's just think ahead a little bit, because I'm actually going to have you do this in a second. What if I wanted to embold that instead? You want to guess what I would? I wouldn't have to do the recorder. I could just type in selection.font.bold. Exactly. See, you could probably even figure some of these things out. Selection.moveDown. Move down? It's a down arrow key. Move down. Notice by what unit? I didn't modify the down arrow key with a shift or anything else, so it's the line. But notice it knew that I did it twice. Down arrow, down arrow. Okay? What if instead of moving down 2 lines, I want to move down 3? Yeah, just do that :3. Good. Okay. And then after I was down there, then I pressed the home key, right? What's different about this line that looks really similar to this line is that selection idea. I wasn't holding down the shift key. I didn't highlight anything. I just wanted to move there. Okay? All right. Now, we could prove to ourselves that works. Should we do that? Yes, thank you. Yeah. I didn't. I don't want to right now. I know I could change bold here. I could change that there. But thanks for reminding me. This time I'm just going to leave that. Let's say we had made some changes, or I want to double check and run it. Be sure to shut down the entire VBA window. Leaving this open means you're leaving the interpreter running, and sometimes, you know, if you don't stop it, you make changes, it won't work right. So I'm going to close down this entire window. Don't panic. Office Word is still there. Now, let's, I'm going to run this, because can you see this is italics right now? I claim that italic command is a toggle, such that if I run this again, what would I expect to happen? It'd be regular. Okay? Let's run it. There it is. Okay? Did you see what happens? It's now regular text. Let's add something to this. But now I don't want to use the macro recorder. I just want to go in and edit it. I want to enter actual VBA code. Okay, now, not sure I can do this here because I don't always remember the syntax real well. It's hard to see there. I'm a little leery of doing it. Okay, I'll do it here. I'll copy it off so you can see. I'm going to add some stuff to this. I'm just going to open up some room. Here's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to modify this such that I'm going to ask the user a question. Would you like me to italicize, or would you like me to bold this line? I'm going to give the user a choice. And I'm going to show you how to embody that choice, that concept of selection that we talked about before, in Visual Basic for Application. Okay? Now, in order to do this, I'm going to use a variable, that field or placeholder. In Visual Basic for Applications, if you're going to use a variable, you have to declare it. And that's done using a command called dim. This is steeped in history. The word dim stands for dimension, and it's how the original BASIC developed in the 1960s or 70s did this. So don't worry about it. All dim says is, I'm going to get a field. I'm going to get a variable now. But I have to tell Visual Basic two things. First of all, I have to tell it the name of the field. I'm going to call it enhance. I could call it anything I want, but it's a good idea to call fields and variables by names that seem to make sense in the context of the program. So here's the field or variable. It's called enhance. Just pretend you can read that. And then the next thing I have to tell it is a field is two things. It's a placeholder and a descriptor of data. So here's my placeholder, a logical box called enhance, but now I have to describe the kind of data that will hold. In Visual Basic, you use the keyword as, but you better have a space here. And then you have to tell it the type. And the type I want is string. String indicates characters, ASCII data. When I type something on the keyboard, I'm going to identify this as a string, as ASCII data. Now, I'm going to add a blank line here just for readability. It's not required, but it just might make it easy. If you could actually see this right now, it would be easier to read. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I got to get a value for enhance. This is that assignment statement, the basic statement in a programming language. It's identified here in Visual Basic for applications with the equal sign. Other languages use different things, and actually in the context of many methods, it's a colon equal. But here, as the assignment statement itself, I just enter an equal sign. The way an assignment statement works is this. When the computer runs this, it will evaluate the expression on the right-hand side, and then whatever that value is, it will remember it in the variable on the left-hand side. But I said I want to ask the user. So the way that I ask the user is I'm going to use a method called input box. You want to guess what input box does? It puts up an input box, it puts up a window, and then the user is going to be able to respond. Now, there are several different parameters that I can put and send to input box. What I'm typing next, right after the word input box, is a left parenthesis followed by a double quote mark, which will be the prompt. It'll be what the user sees. I'm going to ask the user a question. Do you want italics or bold? Now, I know you can't see it yet, but I did something funny. I put brackets around the word, the I in italics and the B in bold. What I'm trying to indicate to the user is type an I or a B. I for italics, B for bold. All right. Here's a couple different general ideas. You have that concept of an assignment statement, that very basic idea. We've got the concept of variables, fields, placeholders, and descriptors. We've got this concept of input, getting something from the user. And the final thing I'll share with you now is selection. How do I allow the computer to make a choice? See, if the user wants bold, we don't want to put italics out there, we want to put bold out there. Well, the common statement that does this is something called an if statement. Now, those two lines there were to home the cursor and select that first line. I'm going to do that regardless. This next line was turning on italics. I don't always want to turn on italics. Let me make a little room here. So here's my line to turn on italics. In Visual Basic, like many other programming languages, selection or choice is done using an if construct. If. Selection is making a choice, and if embodies that idea. Here, so you'll type the word if, it's a keyword, and next you'll present it with the logical operation that it's supposed to be checking on. It's like asking a question. Now, see, if the user typed an I, or if the user typed a B, we'll do something different. Well, how do I know what the user typed? The answer is found in that variable called enhance. So the next thing I'm going to type, and watch me, but the classic thing I do is I misspell things. Visual Basic will yell at me, but if I don't notice it, let me know. Okay. If enhance equal, exactly. Now, it doesn't matter which way we go or start, but let's just put an I there. Oh, you know what? I can't really just type an I. It's a character. Visual Basic might mistake an I for a field or some other things. So since it's a character, since it's ASCII, I'll just put it within double quote marks. If enhance, if the value of my variable enhance is an I, if that's what the user typed in, then that's what I want to do. I do want to have the selection be italics. The if construct will also provide you this else clause. Else. Meaning, if it wasn't an I, now for us we're hoping for just two things, an I or a B, right? So if it wasn't an I, then I can do something else. What do I want to do? Bold it. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this statement. I'm going to, I didn't copy it, did I? Okay. I selected it. I'm going to select this, issue Control-C, move down here, Control-V. I don't want it to say selection.font.italic. I'm going to just say bold. And now finally, I got to tell Visual Basic I'm done with this selection idea. And I do that with the command called endIf. All right? Now, oh yeah, sorry, fooling around here. Delete. Let me copy all this off so you can, oops. Let me copy this off so you can see it a little better. And again, if you're concerned about writing all this down, I wouldn't be that concerned about that. It is all here. If you just think about logically what's happening, I think that'd be better. Here is our command. Okay, so one idea was the idea of a variable. Enhance is a word that I made up. You could call it whatever you want. But warning, give it a meaningful name. Too many programmers use one-character variable names, X or Z or 29Q. Don't do it. Nobody's going to understand your code, and you won't understand it a week from now either. Pick a word that identifies the type of contents of that variable. So here's a variable called enhance. What is it? It's type string. It's going to hold a character. Here's that assignment statement. I'm going to put something into that variable now. What am I going to put into it? I'm going to use this input box method. I'm going to pass it the parameter, do you want italics or bold? We saw these two commands before. Here is our main if, else, and if construct. Here's where the selection happens. What the computer will do, if the value is I, it will do this. If the value isn't I, which we assume is a B then, it will do that. It will still move down twice and move on. Great. Now at this point in time, if you make a mistake, oftentimes Visual Basic for applications will yell at you. Don't panic. It just means you did something wrong. Figure it out, get rid of it, go back. Now, every time I enter a line, Visual Basic remembers this. It's an interpreter. I don't have to save anything. I could just exit out. And now, let's run our macro. Aha! I know you can't read it. It says, do you want italics or bold? So I'll type something in here. If I type a B and issue OK, notice it did bold. And we already know what happens if we run it again, right? If I say B a second time, B is a toggle, get rid of that. Okay. Now, we should test this, right? Let's test it with an I. Make sure that I works and we still get italics, and there we go. Now, of course, it might be worthwhile to test it with some invalid input. Let's give it a C. Whoa. What happened there? I typed in a C, which is supposed to be an I or a B, right? And it did bold. Exactly. This is an example of what programmers call a semantic error. It's an error in meaning. I meant for this to only work with I or B. However, when I look at my code and investigate it very carefully, what I notice is if it's not an I, nothing here says it has to be a B, right? If it's anything but an I, it's going to make it bold. Now, could we fix that? Sure. We could add another if statement. We could add a clause to the else that says it has to be a B. And then, of course, if we entered a C, nothing would happen because it was neither an I or a B. In the world of programming, there are two kinds of errors. Syntax errors. These are the simple ones. The syntax errors are when you do stuff like this. Oh, yeah, that's good. Okay. It says, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not how an assignment statement should appear. Okay. But the more difficult ones, those are the easy ones, because in this case, the interpreter finds them as soon as you press the enter key. The harder ones are the semantic errors, the errors in meaning. The program didn't do what you wanted it to do. Why? Because it did exactly what you told it to do. Good. All right. I want to take this to one more level now. There are much of what we did here we could have done through the recorder, but there are some things that you can't use the recorder for. And especially for this third kind of control structure, and that's looping. If you want your program to repeat certain lines, you can't do that through the macro recorder. You have to do it through Visual Basic for Applications. What I'm going to do is, after the user says whether they want a B or an I, I'm going to have this do it for 3 lines. So I'll have it highlight one line, move down 2, highlight the next line, move down 2, highlight the next line, move down 2. I'm going to add a loop to this program. I'm going to use the repetition control structure. Now, there are a number of different ideas that have to be added to this loop. Many loops need something known as a loop counter. If I want to do this 3 times, I basically have to count. Okay, I've done it once, I've done it twice, I've done it 3 times. In programming, if you want to remember something like a count, that requires a variable. Programs remember things using variables. Now, we saw how to do a variable already in Visual Basic. That's the dim command. I'm going to pick a different name for a variable. I'm going to call it lines. This will be how many lines I either embold or italicize. Dim lines. That's not enough. I got to add this keyword as. Yeah. Now this, integer as a matter of fact. This one here, I don't want a string. I didn't point this out before. You see this feature called autocomplete. Once Visual Basic figures out what you're doing, it will give you lots of different options for what can legitimately, syntactically follow. Oh, look, I know you can't read that. It says Boolean. Do you know Boolean? Yeah, it could be a true or a false. But the one that we actually want is called integer. If you start typing, and I'm typing INT, you can see ultimately get there, I can press a number of keys like the tab key, and that will put it in there. Don't have to worry about that. I just point it out because you'll see this autocomplete likely come up. You might be concerned about it. It's just trying to help you fundamentally. Okay, good. So I've got my new variable here for my number of lines. And here's the other thing I need to do. I need to initialize this variable. I want it to start somewhere. Now, being good IT professionals, we usually start counting at 0, right? So I'm going to put in an assignment statement that says lines equal 0. It's going to start with the value of 0. Now, sorry, this keyboard's really throwing me off. If you don't know, where the cursor keys are can vary, and this one is giving me a hard time here. Now I'm going to construct my loop. When we saw with the if and else statements, we saw, there's sort of a block structure. Started with an if, ends with this end if thing. We're going to do something similar with our looping construct. There are a number of different ways to do a loop in any programming language, including Visual Basic for applications. I'm going to show you one way. If you know another way or have read about another way, that's fine. There are many legitimate ways to solve the problem. But notice where I'm going to begin this loop. After I've homed the cursor. So I know you can't see this very well, but first of all, I'm going to ask the user, do you want italics or bold? Then I'm going to home the cursor. I don't want to continuously home the cursor, do I? If I have the loop beginning before home the cursor, it's going to home the cursor and home the cursor. We don't want that. I'm going to begin the loop here. One example of a loop in Visual Basic is the do until construct. Do until construct. I type in the keyword do until, and then within parentheses I give it the logical test. How long will I continue to do this particular loop? And I'm going to say lines greater than 3. Do until, parentheses, lines greater than 3. Now, that's the top of the loop. At this point in time, I'm going to add some comments because I can't even keep track of this. Start of loop. Notice I can type those in. I just type single quote mark, start of loop. I think I'm going to add this in front of here, selection. Oh, by the way, those are horrible comments. Anybody who can read Visual Basic code can tell that a do until is the start of a loop. A good comment explains why you're doing something. If your comment just re-echoes the code, like selection in front of an if statement, we all know once you program that an if statement does selection. A good comment explains why. So I'll put start of loop. I'll leave that there because we're trying to learn the programming language too. But why are we trying to do this? We want to repeat our, I'm going to use the word highlight, but realize highlight might include giving it a color too or something like that. We're going to repeat our highlight a certain number, I can't spell either, of times. We want, in other words, we want to highlight a certain number of lines. Good. Okay. Now, notice that I asked the user the question before I got in the loop. No need to continually ask the user. And I've homed the cursor before I get in the loop. But now that I'm in the loop, I am going to extend selection. I'm going to either do the bold or italics. I'm also going to move down to, I'm going to home the cursor to get ready for the next iteration of this. Now, I'm going to make a mistake now. Don't panic. To close off the loop, I type the keyword loop. So this is the, what did I say? Start? What's the opposite of start? Finish? Finish of loop. And I am missing something. If you've programmed before, how long will that thing loop? Forever. This is an infinite loop. Why? I start lines off at 0. My loop do until asks the question, is lines greater than 3? Is 0 greater than 3? No. Every time it goes through the loop, what's the value of lines? 0. I need to add a special kind of assignment statement here. I need to update the value of lines. I've done it one time. I want to add 1 to the value. In some programming languages, there's a special keyword, the plus plus, that will do this. It's a function known as increment. If you don't have that available, then you have to do it yourself. And this assignment statement looks weird. Here it is. Lines equal lines plus 1. I'm going to add the comment increment, or add 1 to lines here. Let me copy this code off so we can see it a little better. Okay, let's find this. Yes, that did not work. Well, let's put it here. See this statement here? Lines equal lines plus 1. This is not mathematical equality. We're not dealing with a calculator here. This is an assignment statement. The way the assignment statement works is as follows. First of all, the computer evaluates the expression on the right-hand side. First time through this loop, what's the value of lines? 0. 0 plus 1, what's the answer? 1. And then the next thing the computer does is it will assign or remember that value 1 in that variable. The reason we call them variables is because the content can change or vary. It used to be 0, now it's 1. The next time through the loop it'll be 2. The next time through the loop it'll be 3. Cool. All right, should we do it? Did I make any mistakes here? Maybe. We'll find out. Let's toggle that back. Let's get this all set. Let's put the cursor somewhere. Let's run this. Macros. There it is. Run. What do we want? What do you want? Bold or italics? Bold. Aha! There. It embolded 4 lines. Why did it do that? Ah, you caught it, right? I started lines at 0, and my test was greater than 3. Right? If I changed my test to greater than or equal to 3, or if I started lines at 1, then I'd get 3 there. Again, another semantic mistake. I'm just trying to point out that it's not easy. It's easy to make mistakes, truly, when you're programming. Okay. So, guess what? Why did we do all that? Well, I want you to have the opportunity to actually practice this. So, this evening, you can absolutely use our facilities and practice macros. And that would not be wasted effort because homework assignment 3C is going to ask you to create a macro. It's similar to this. You're going to be using those 3 constructs that we've talked about before. Sequence, one after the other. Selection, make a choice. And repetition, repeat. It's going to be something similar to this, although not exact, and you're going to have to read it a little carefully and do a little more to it. But I'd encourage you to do some experimentation also. I think this is an example of where the more you do, the better it will become. Do you have any questions right now about macros in Office Word? Questions will come up when you try it, I know. Yeah. All righty. On-campus people, a couple more things to say, but I think as far as recording is concerned, that's good enough. Sure hope I had that set. Yeah, I think I did. Capture primary screen. Hopefully you can see it at a distance. That'd be helpful. Okay, we're done for today.